In this portion of chapter 15, we're looking at oxidation of carbon for fuel, or rather carbon fuels. We'll look at the role of phosphates and then stages of energy extraction from food. We'll save this last piece for another video. So in general, the carbon that we take in our food, the fats, the carbohydrates, etc., these are ultimately reduced to CO2. And this is the end goal, we're getting to CO2. And depending on the type of structure that carbon was originally part of, we can extract different amounts of energy. So differing amounts of free energy are going to be released. And we can see that here. And these are just examples of substances and their relative energy associated with them, going from most to least. And so while these aren't necessarily the fuel molecules we're taking into our body, this shows us how we can take this carbon, convert it to CO2, and extract energy. So this is just a variety of different carbon-based compounds. And here, the more reduced the substance, the more energy that's going to be released upon oxidation. So simple depiction of oxidation of carbon-based molecules. We know that actual fuel molecules are going to be much more complex. But ultimately what we're doing this energy that we're getting from this, we are going to use to produce ATP. So these are more prominent fuel molecules that we have. It's just illustrating some of the substances that will serve as fuel. These are substances that, through a variety of metabolic processes, will be oxidized. And in that process, ATP is produced. So we see glucose. Glucose here is one of the fuels that we can take in, any carbohydrate. And then we have a fatty acid here as well. As just an example of how the oxidation of carbon compounds ends in the production of ATP, we can use glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So this is not the only example that exists. This is just a way for us to see one case where we can take a carbon-based compound and break it down, and in the process of breaking this down, we can get ATP out of it. So here we see this glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is going to undergo oxidation, and we will produce 3-phosphoglyceric acid, or 3-phosphoglycerate. So the top here is showing the overall reaction process that occurs. But this overall process is actually a two-step process. So here's our first step and our second step. Glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate releases electrons, and the electrons that the substance releases, they are going to be picked up by that NAD+. We're also going to have what's referred to as an acyl phosphate involved in the process. So through this conversion, or this moving rearrangement of electrons, we end up taking glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and forming 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. The NAD+ becomes NADH. And we have an extra proton in there as well. That 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate is then going to, it becomes a phosphoryl transfer substance. If you remember looking at those tables, 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate is a substance that has a high phosphoryl transfer energy associated with it. So this 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate can take that phosphate group and it can transfer it to ADP. We form 3-phosphoglyceric acid and ATP in the process. So it shows how the hydrolysis of 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate can be coupled to ATP synthesis. Now, more than 90% of the ATP that is generated comes from proton gradients. process where we're making ATP from these proton gradients is referred to as oxidative phosphorylation, and it's covered in chapter 18, and so we won't get to that detailed process this semester. But it is a process that occurs. The ATP hydrolysis can then be used to form different ion gradients, which can then be used to drive different processes. But this is just showing how we have a proton gradient that's created. That proton gradient, if you remember in the last figure, we had protons being produced as part of the overall breakdown of that 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Well, the original glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Those protons were being released. So protons are coming from the oxidation of fuels. You're going to end up with that proton gradient being used to form the ATP. And 90% of our ATP comes from this. In terms of phosphates and their role in biochemical processes, really there's nothing more to say than just that phosphate esters are thermodynamically unstable and kinetically stable. So their energy release is going to be able to be manipulated by enzymes. And so this is helpful in terms of the regulatory process. But we've also seen how these phosphate groups can be added and removed and how they play a role in the production of energy and the use of energy. Now, when we're talking about extracting energy from food, this extraction process, there are 3 stages by which energy is extracted from foodstuff. We have the large molecules in food being broken down into smaller molecules through digestion. Small molecules are processed into key molecules of metabolism, such as acetyl-CoA. And then ATP is produced from the complete oxidation of the acetyl component of acetyl-CoA. So in the first stage, when we're up here in this first stage, proteins are going to be hydrolyzed to amino acids, polysaccharides are going to be hydrolyzed to glucose, lipids are going to be hydrolyzed to glycerol and fatty acids. These are all things that we've seen in the past. So our proteins go to amino acids, our polysaccharides to glucose, and our lipids to glycerol and fatty acids. These substances can then be absorbed and distributed throughout the body. There's no energy that's captured in this initial process. It's just a preparation stage to get these substances ready to enter the normal metabolic processes. In the second stage here, this involves the small molecules being degraded further into some simpler units. And it's the simple units that will play a role in metabolism. So, for example, some of the sugars, fatty acids, glycerol, some of the amino acids, all of these through other pathways can be converted into acetyl-CoA, and then the acetyl-CoA can enter that normal Krebs cycle. A small amount of ATP will be generated as these molecules are converted into smaller key molecules. In this third stage, this is where much of the production of ATP is going to occur. This stage involves complete oxidation of the acetyl portion of acetyl-CoA. The acetyl-CoA will enter the Krebs cycle. It will be oxidized to CO2. Throughout this whole process, there's going to be 4 pairs of electrons that are transferred. And remember, when we're talking about transfer of electrons, that NAD plus and FAD are going to be the carriers that are going to come into play. And this is going to be for each round of acetyl group that's oxidized. So you have 4 pairs of electrons that are transferred. 3 of those pairs are going to transfer to the NAD plus. You have 1 pair of electrons that's going to transfer to the FAD. You're going to create a proton gradient that's going to be generated through this process. That proton gradient will be used to make more ATP through the citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. So ATP is going to be produced from the complete oxidation of the components of acetyl-CoA, that acetyl portion. And so this last slide, we're just looking at the overall stages of metabolism. So what we were talking about before, you take, remember that food extraction in the first step, you take these food molecules and you're going to break them down into smaller ones, and that's digestion. So that we're just looking at digestion there. And then those molecules that come out of digestion, those substances are going to be further processed and broken down into key metabolic intermediates. And through a variety of different methods, which we'll talk about in other chapters, these substances will eventually, through different pathways, be converted into this acetyl-CoA. And then the acetyl portion, which is a carbon portion, is going to enter the citric acid cycle, where it's going to undergo a number of reactions and in the process produce some electrons and ultimately have ATP production associated with it. So again, from this video, we looked at the oxidation of carbon fuels, the role, we briefly mentioned the role of phosphates in biochemical processes, and the stages of energy extraction that were coming from the food that we consume. And this is where we're going to get all of that ATP, and it's going to be done through a variety of different steps or stages in the catabolic process.